Hello, and thanks all for attending today's session with this is Tony Byrne here at Real Story Group. This is Scott Dill. I'm the Director of Business Development, and really excited to have you spend part of your day with us today. We expect this to be about a 30-minute session, and as a couple of quick housekeeping items of note, so we will have time at the end of today's meeting for questions. So if you do have questions or feedback you'd like to share, please enter that into the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. And we will be sharing today's slide deck. So that should be available later this week. So keep an eye out on your email from our marketing team with that. And then to our subscribers on the line, you're the heart of our business, and we appreciate you. And you will also be able to access a recording of today's session in your subscriber library. So keep an eye out for that as we continue to move forward. To get started, I do want to address a little bit about Real Story Group. I do see a lot of new names in the webinar here today, and we appreciate your time. So we've been around for almost 20 years, and today we're going to take things back to roots when it comes to web content management. You'll see on the next slide the CMS S-Watch logo. That's actually how we got our started covering the web content management space, and that's certainly Tony's bread and butter when it comes to why we started the company. As really what was happening is the reports we were seeing out there in the marketplace weren't matching. So we started a company to really give you the real story behind what these vendors do well and where they also could potentially fall short. So we don't work for or advise the vendors we cover in any way. Since that time, we've expanded our map here to include areas like digital asset management, customer data platforms. And today what we're going to do is actually focus on where does web content management really fall within this broader omni-channel tech stack. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Tony to take you through the heart of today's presentation. Tony?
Great, thanks, Scott. Real pleasure to be here with everyone today. It's a big group on the line, but we will have time to answer your questions at the end, so feel free to pose them at any time. Anything you agree with, disagree with, want to add as commentary or ask as a question, just use the questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. So yeah, it's been 25 years since I first laid hands on a web content management system, 20 years since I founded CMS Watch, now Real Story Group. So I have a lot of, I would say, sort of emotional attachment to this technology. And so you might expect that I'm here to tell you that web content management is the be all and end all of the future of your digital engagement. But in fact, actually, what I'm going to be suggesting today is that web content management, the scope of it is getting more circumscribed with every year. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's something for you to really be aware of as you think about how your stack might be different in the 2020s. So let's start with a look at what's happening in the marketplace as a whole. It has been really for the past 25 years a remarkably fragmented marketplace. That's kind of analyst speak for there's a hell of a lot of WCM vendors out there. But it is evolving in some important ways. So let's look at the marketplace as a whole. Those of you who follow our research know that we tend to evaluate vendors on a complexity spectrum. This isn't some magic quadrant where we're designating that one vendor is better than the other. There's no magic to being on one end or the other, but there is quite decidedly a complexity spectrum where the ones towards the left tend to offer more native richness, certainly more customizability and extensibility, but they're also going to be more complex, both from a UX and a developer standpoint. They're definitely going to be more developer intensive, and they most certainly are going to have higher long-term total cost of ownership. And then that all, of course, shifts as you go from left to right. So once again, this is a highly fragmented marketplace. Traditional analyst firms like Gartner and Forrester don't really get this marketplace, tend to focus on just a few vendors. They miss the breadth of the market. Certainly, WCM has responded to the cloud, but we do see platform as a service still largely predominating over software as a service, which is another way of saying that these solutions tend to be still very single tenant solutions. And so that has some implications. There's what's fascinating about this, and we support dozens of different WCM selection projects a year, is that there's significant competition that persists around usability, modernity, and other issues. And still, there's also a clear divide between platforms and products. So that's the blue sort of vertical line you see to the left, where The ones to the left of that are more platform-oriented, to the right are more product-oriented. Platform-oriented means that you better have at least one developer on staff who's conversant with that particular tool, because you really need developers to make those platforms hum, whereas the ones to the right are really tend to be kind of more out of the box. Once they're set up, they tend to be kind of configure and forget. But there's also some significant trends that are happening in this marketplace, even though it remains highly fragmented. There are some things that have been transpiring in the past couple of years that I think are really important for you. And in particular, the marketplace is getting a little bit compressed. So what's happening on the far right is that some of the simpler solutions have maybe become almost too simplistic, or rather they've been crowded out of the market by sort of site maker platforms like you might get from sort of Squarespace and its many competitors. So I think there's a lot of questions about the lower end of the market, the validity and the usefulness of these platforms. And then, of course, if you look in the lower left, where we've grayed out what we call the so-called dinosaur vendors from some larger kind of legacy platforms. These tend to be platforms that you leave rather than you license afresh. But what's interesting too that we're seeing, particularly in the last 18 months or so, and I think even in the last 6 months, a lot of questions getting called about this, are significant problems around the toolkit category. That there's questions around whether these platforms aren't too heavy for the needs of today. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. But even the upper range solutions in here, I think that in many cases, they're struggling to justify their total cost of ownership. Is that, do I really need this degree of complexity based on what I'm trying to do on my websites? And it's not that our websites themselves are necessarily getting simpler, but certainly as the technology is evolving and our stacks are evolving, it changes the nature of what we're looking for from a web content management platform. So what we've kind of taken to calling this over the last 18 months or so is this kind of, because what we call sort of a great pause at the top of the marketplace. Enterprises kind of asking themselves, do I really need this much? And there's a couple of different things going on here just within the WCM marketplace that relate to this. But then there's a bigger picture around what's happening in your stack. So first and foremost, I think a lot of what's going on right now is enterprises really rethinking their WCM investments. And part of this is around trying to right-size their WCM investments, many of which are legacy investments, relative to other digital needs, and asking themselves, are our WCM investments crowding out some other forms of inbound and outbound engagement that we should be doing? And I think part of what's happening here is a greater attention to marketing attribution. It's driving closer scrutiny of the investments that are getting made around inbound marketing in general, and indeed our public websites. Of course, everybody needs a public website. Or even a customer-only website. But the issue is, what's the relative importance of this relative to other digital investments that we're making, including applications and outbound communications, and of course chatbots and everything else. Yes, there's content underneath all those platforms, but do we really need a CMS in this context to do the same things that maybe we wanted it to do before? The other big thing that I think the market has been a little bit slower to wake up to is this third point here, which is, if you look at the mid-market vendors in the WCM space, they can now do 80% or more of what the upper tier vendors can do. So in that context, do I actually need all of that extra complexity and developer intensivity? Am I really truly going to leverage that? Or can I get 80 or 90% of what I need in a platform that literally could be 1/3 the cost, 1/3 the complexity, which means potentially 3 times more agile for you as well? Then the other thing that's happening here, I think, which I'll talk about in a second, is these I think some relationship frustrations with some of the MarTech suite vendors. And so by these, I mean the major firms like Adobe, Oracle, what used to be IBM, what is now largely Acoustic, certainly Salesforce, Acquia, and others, where there's a sense that some of these relationships, which nominally are supposed to be consultative, have actually become highly transactional, that what these vendors are really pushing for is not optimal solutions for me or even integrated solutions that share a stack, a lot more selling rather than consulting. Customer events, when they were both in person and even digital, a lot more about merchandising and not always about best practices. And so, there's a sense that more is not always better from a client perspective. You would hope that getting a number of your tools from the same vendor might give you some advantages with respect to integration. That's not always the case, and certainly might give you greater than the sum of the parts. But often, what it really is an invitation for the vendor to get inside and try to cross-sell you even more. And so, all of this is coming together within the WCM marketplace. It's having, at least among our subscriber base, a lot of questions being asked about what are sometimes 7 or even 8-figure annual spends on web content management. Is this really the best use of our resources? And so, as a practical matter, what we always recommend is if you're looking at some of the major name vendors, that's just all well and good. But as you do that, you should also be looking at lower tier vendors, which may be just as good or even better fit for your needs. So another way of putting this is don't default to a vendor because it's a name vendor or because they're already an incumbent in your environment for one reason or another. So that's what's happening within the WCM marketplace, which I think I would just summarize as the marketplace becoming more compressed towards the middle, the mid-market becoming a lot more functional, a lot of questions being asked about the more complex and expensive tools, whether they're really worth it at this point in time. But then there's the bigger picture of WCM in your broader stack, and this really comes down to your notions of omnichannel and what does that mean, both from a business perspective and from an architectural perspective. So let's take a look here. And if we're going to look forward, which we will be, let's also start though by starting back with a little bit of history. So we're going to do kind of a decade by decade story here, starting out with the 2000s, back when we founded CMS Watch. This was our original reference model for what a web content management system did. It took in content, often from a variety of different sources, provided a library where you could organize that content, and also a factory where you could apply some workflow and rules. And then even the earliest web content management systems were nominally multi-channel. They could push out web pages, but also PDF files, XML-based syndication, often pushed to wireless devices, even over these funky wireless markup languages. So there was always a multi-channel story. It may not have been sophisticated, but the idea was that the website, your website was sort of the center of your existence, and then there were different derivations of that website that you would push out into different channels. So that was kind of the model for the 2000s. By the 2010s, it had really changed, where there was a number of different engagement systems that were part of the digital marketing toolkit. And I think a lot of us spent that decade trying to modernize this content and engagement management environment by bringing in maybe digital asset management platform, feeding assets into a WCM, integrating that with marketing automation or email service provider and social engagement, and then that all driving up through different delivery services up to these major channels. And so it was really a model of kind of horizontal integration, with WCM as being still kind of the digital engine behind a lot of the marketing that you're trying to do. So this was a successful model as far as it goes. It was hamstrung in a lot of ways by, first, really poor access to customer data through whatever kind of customer data backbone, typically homegrown, that you had, or on an intranet maybe hamstrung by your inability to get access to proper HR data to customize, personalize an experience. But the other thing is that this ended up leading to a lot of different silos of activity. And so the larger issue here is, how do I address that? And what's interesting about this is the major analyst firms basically came out and said, well, the answer to this is this digital experience platform, this idea that a single vendor can provide all of these things, right? And what's interesting about this is what they told the market, but then what they would tell their clients often was, well, DXPs don't really exist. And so this was really a vendor fantasy that large vendors foisted on gullible analyst firms who are also their customers to pretend that there's such a thing as a DXP, which is this like amalgamation of different tools all under some nominal framework. And DXPs don't really exist. These are portal vendors and WCM vendors still trying to find some relevancy at the close of the last decade. Now, to be sure, there is a customer problem underneath all of this. And this is really where the 2010s brought us to, was this silo problem, where if we look at this from the customers into the glass, as opposed to the enterprise outward, you have these isolated, disjointed, inconsistent experiences where you have all of these different customer touch points that you see here in gray. But the issue was each one has their own content store, their own data, typically their own rules and planning artifacts, and then their own analytics subsystem. And it becomes impossible to then have the kind of coherent customer experience that we all really want to provide. And so the answer to this, we believe, is through the application of foundation services. And it's been really fascinating watching some of the leaders among our council of MarTech stack leaders really take to this sort of architecture and implement it, and some of the benefits that it brings to them. This is still very much an aspirational target reference model, but we're seeing it really emerge where you have omnichannel operations. First and foremost, you have unified customer data. Unified customer data was the topic of our last omnichannel leadership tech stack a meeting where we brought 35 of our subscribers together, and we had a great conversation the other day about customer data. Clearly table stakes for doing this. Journey orchestration, customer intelligence, and then in red, this notion of omnichannel content, which is a single source of the truth for reusable assets. This is increasingly critical. What's interesting about this, and we'll come back to this a little bit later, is that most web content management systems can't actually do that. So that is another reason why I think the traditional WCM model is a little bit of a dead end, and you don't want to necessarily sort of overinvest in that model. But what this means more broadly is that if you look at from the bottom up, you have these enterprise foundation platforms, and these are really the brains of your new stack. So the idea here is that the decision making and the ordering and all of the key activity is really happening here in this bottom layer, where you're having omnichannel content, customer data platform, journey orchestration, personalization. And then web content management becomes still remains a key player in your content engagement management layer. It's still assembling and contextualizing experiences, but it's more of an order taker as opposed to a decision maker. And so if it's an order taker, then do you really need the kind of complexity that there was before? Now, major vendors with a real stake in this game have been trying to shove a lot of that intelligence and data into their WCM platform and say, well, it can be that as well as all of your enterprise foundation services. So are CRM vendors, so are email and marketing automation vendors. You want to avoid those sorts of legacy architectures and really invest in your enterprise foundation platforms, and then get lighter and more agile at the content and engagement management tier, where again, they become more order takers rather than decision makers. And so I think this is particularly an issue for some of the major WCM vendors. And so we'll just start with Sitecore here. I don't mean to necessarily pick on them, but they're the first example I'm going to use of a vendor that nominally is going to say, look, in this single platform or suite of tools, I can do all these sorts of things. So if you just license Sitecore, then you're good to go. So that's not a bad strategy for a small to mid-market firm, where very often you want the same software suite to do a lot of things for you. At the enterprise level, this sort of strategy just simply isn't going to work. You're going to want more of a fit-for-purpose type approach, separations of concern here, where you're separating data from different engagement silos. You're separating content from different engagement silos. You're managing your orchestration across multiple platforms. This is really, we believe, a dead end where these platforms, the WCM platform, has simply gotten too bloated for its own good. But I could make the same case, certainly, about the acoustic model, and even vendors that have tried to do, and Oracle for that matter, and vendors that have tried to do roll-ups like Acquia, but even Adobe, where again, they want to try to sell you that, hey, there's multiple different products from our suite that will help you get there. The issue is, how do you know, since they've done these through acquisition, how do you know that their email platform is going to be the right fit for you just because you're working well with their WCM platform? You don't. You don't know that it's going to be a good fit for you. And so you're kind of taking it on faith that they're going to integrate it, but The issue is it really going to work for your stack? So, and it's the same thing with the WCM platform. You shouldn't necessarily license the WCM platform from, say, HubSpot just because you're using them for email marketing. It may not work for your team. And so you're often left with this, where you say, okay, well, our incumbent or sister platform will work for you. I'm a marketer. I need to drill a small hole in a piece of wood every Friday. And somebody says, oh, hey, we already have this drill press. And I see a lot of marketers trying to drill small holes with big drill presses, and it's just not working. It's not working, people. And you do them a disservice, and you do your enterprise a disservice by making them do this every Friday. And so what you need to do is think about how does this work from our customer going backwards, and how can we be more agile? And we believe that being more agile means being lighter at the engagement tier, certainly with respect to web content and experience management, but also email, CRM, and any number of other engagement services where you have an opportunity to get simpler. So the other thing that I mentioned here is that the rise of what we're calling omnichannel content platforms. So this is still a very immature market. It's not as capable as maybe we might like it to be. There's certainly demand out there. The idea is that they manage narrative content, text content, as well as image and media assets, as well as data artifacts, all as first-class objects. So that makes it somewhat unique. And they can handle both component content and compound content. So the component content might be for email components, mobile promos, social elements, micro content, micro experiences, so on and so forth. And this turns out to be technically somewhat complex. The vast majority of WCM vendors cannot do this. Even the ones who say they do, like, for example, Contentful, have truly awful asset management. So an asset management, again, has to be a first-class content type in this kind of a platform. So, you know, the reality is that this is likely to be a new and emergent space. We're seeing some vendors emerge out of the digital asset management or DAM space to do this. This is going to be something to keep on your radar. You may not be ready for it yet, and it may not be ready for you, but the reality is that your web content management system may not get you there. Or another way of putting it is your web content management system might be fine for multi-channel syndication of narrative-heavy content, but it's unlikely to be a true omni-channel content platform for all of the different data, asset, and text components that you're going to need to distribute and track. So what that also means is that the kind of flexibility that we're going to require from web content management systems going forward is that we see really a kind of a more hybrid world. So first, hybrid with respect to web content management systems are going to have to coexist with other content management systems, but also natively within the WCM itself, you're going to need to be able to support a lot of different types of emerging models for this. And so I'm going to probably cover off the formal part of the presentation here. And once again, I'll remind you, if you have any questions, comments, things you agree with, disagree with, anything you'd like to dive deeper on, feel free to use the questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. But again, the future is going to be hybrid. So we'll talk first here about that sexy term of headless content management system. By now, you probably all know what that means, which means it's a system that manages content in the back end, but doesn't actually assemble and deliver that content through templates. It just provides that content through some sort of an API. A popular model, particularly among more IT-oriented shops, the issue here is that many content managers also want to manage experiences and sometimes want to manage pages, and headless systems are very bad at that. So what we've seen emerge in the marketplace is this notion of sort of the more hybrid model where marketers can manage pages where it makes sense, as well as experiences and micro experiences, but you also still have some sort of REST API into the content itself so that you can syndicate the content in a more naked way out to all the different presentation environments that you might require, including potentially applications beyond your website. So we think the future is really hybrid. Fortunately, much of the marketplace is going that way. There are still some vendors who have this religious adherence to the headless model. We think that's a mistake, that there are headless use cases, but by picking a headless only solution, you're basically isolating yourself and your marketing team to a limited number of use cases. So part of what's also at issue here are some other mixed paradigms, not just architecture, but also with respect to editorial and syndication models. So what we have seen editorially is the rise of these sort of medium style, very fluid block type editorial models, which is great. And what this is also pointing to is the content driving the experience rather than the template itself constraining what you can say. So this is really owes to the great rise in the discipline of content strategies and having your content really drive the experience. And so that's great that this is all maturing, and what it means with respect to CMS is much more fluid editorial models. And so in particular, I think we've seen a kind of renewed interest in more sort of page management, or things that we would associate with page management, which is not just putting content into simple edit boxes, but also moving different widgets around, being able to create a more holistic experience. But there are still times when you need structure. There's still times when you do just need a kind of a naked text box because this content is going to be marked up in a lot of different environments. And so what we're really seeing as successful is the emergence of sort of hybrid editorial and authoring models that support both types of use cases. And then finally, this notion that it's not always content that you're trying to syndicate. Sometimes you need to syndicate experiences or micro experiences where I don't want to just manage content that's going out to a web application, but where possible, I want to actually manage that particular widget or that particular component itself. There's a lot of complexity and issues here around UX, security, any number of other things, but certainly this is what marketers want to do, particularly if you want to manage beyond your website. So the future is going to be hybrid, both with respect to architecture, editorial models, and syndication. So the good news is that even in the mid-market of the web content management system, we see some awareness of this, some movement in this direction. And so you won't necessarily just have to go with a high-end tool to get these sorts of capabilities. All right, so let's wrap up here and then get to your questions. WCM marketplace fragmented as ever, but it's compressing a little bit, both from the top and the bottom. And I think in general, that's a good thing because it means that you can get more value out of the investments that you're making. Again, some cautions around both the top and the bottom of the marketplace. The top of the marketplace is overstretching horizontally, and many, I won't say all, but many licensees are realizing that they've potentially overinvested here. And I think you therefore have the opportunity and maybe even the obligation to sort of lighten your investment in web content management and right-size it with a system that's going to be a better, less obtrusive, less duplicative player in your stack. And in part and parcel, this is recognizing that the WCM vendor of the future, certainly of today, may provide some multi-channel syndication capabilities, but it's typically not going to be an omni-channel solution, and you may need to look elsewhere for that. You definitely always want to apply design thinking to your tech selection process to make sure you get a solution that will work for your team. Make sure that you go through a test-based selection process and just don't default to a vendor because you already have some solutions from that vendor, or it's a big name in the marketplace. And if there's any way that our team at RSG can help you do that, please let Scott know. And at the end of the day, this also means avoiding sort of architectural purity as well. Is that a page-only system was a thing of the past, but a headless-only system is probably not the right future for you. So I'll pause here and we'll take a look at what the questions are in, and then in the meantime, Scott can talk about next steps.
Great, thanks, Tony. And again, thanks to all of you for your time today. A couple things I want to just mention here. If you want to get a more detailed look at our research on web content management or any of the other areas we cover, you're welcome to download complimentary samples from our website. I'm also happy to take you on a 15-20 minute overview of the Real Story Group customer experience so you can get an idea of what would be available to you as an RSG customer. So if that's of interest, just email explore@realstorygroup.com. Really two main ways in which we work with our customers. One is through self-service research and access to our sites. The other is more of an advisory role where we'll advise on one particular marketplace or perhaps your entire omni-channel tech stack. And as Tony mentioned, as part of that, you'd also can become a member of our Stack Leadership Council, which meets 3 to 4 times a year. So reach out to us at explore@realstorygroup.com if that's something you'd like to discuss further. With that, Tony, I'll kick things over to you. There's a couple questions have come in.
Yeah. So thanks. Got a question from Declan who's asking, do you see low-code vendors breaking into the WCMS space? Declan, it's hard to know for sure, but I tend to think probably not. They're likely to be partners to web content management systems, that the low-code platforms are likely going to be useful for generating diverse experiences, some of which may be content-driven, others may be more services-driven. And so they might be assembling content or micro experiences from your content management system, but otherwise are more about assembling the front end. So probably more like in partnership with it. Where do you, Glenn is asking, where do I see WP Engine or Automatic fitting into the complexity spectrum? So we had WordPress in the mid-market. And so, of course, there's different hosting models you can get and different distributions of WordPress, much like there is for Drupal as well. And I think I would put almost all of them in the mid-market. There are some lower-end alternatives for WordPress solutions as well. But WordPress we see kind of quite firmly these days in the mid-market, in as much as you still do need a developer to really make it work these days. Do I categorize Acquia as omni or multi? Definitely more multi-channel. Acquia does, really is not an omni-channel content platform for a variety of different reasons. David is asking, do you have any opinion on which vendors, if any, are doing hybrid particularly well? Well, it's a really good question, David. I think that the energy for this is really coming more from the traditional vendors who have the traditional models, who are being pushed quite properly by the headless vendors to say, look, there are important headless use cases here. And so the traditional vendors already have the page and component management and the potential for experience fragments and other sorts of things that you want in a more hybrid environment, and are likely to come at it a little bit more successfully. Now, there may be limits on their API with respect to their headless use cases, so you do need to explore that very carefully, David. But I think the vendors that are really headed in a dark alley are the ones that are religiously headless. I think it's going to be an ecumenical world in the future, and the ones that are like religiously headless, I think are going to crowd themselves into a corner. So the final question is from Melissa. Where do you see Microsoft in all of this? And the reality is, Melissa, I don't see Microsoft anywhere anymore. They've pretty much given up the ghost on web content management almost completely. There's some landing page capabilities in some of their marketing tools, but otherwise, with the demise of SharePoint web content management, it's largely out of the market, shall we say. Mark is asking, do even simpler Jamstack approaches have a place here with an emphasis on APIs to add in third-party engagement services? Absolutely. I mean, I think that this is similar to the question around low code. There's definitely experiences that you want to assemble that are almost bringing us back to the old portal days, but thankfully doing it a lot in a much lighter way, where I can assemble content experiences and services from a variety of different places on a single screen. So that's great. The issue is, who manages that screen? What are the capabilities for experienced people to actually be involved in the management of that? It may not be quite as headless from a content management perspective as you might first presume if you actually talk to real marketing people. So Receive is asking, for global brands, where is it settling? Marketing stack is foundation, but is a sledgehammer for use cases that just want quick presence online. Yeah, so, For global brands, a lot of it depends on the internationalization model. And we see a lot of hybrid there too, where there's this core central set of capabilities, but there's certain marketplaces where they need simpler solutions and allow the local brands to be able to experiment sometimes with simpler platforms for a variety of good reasons. Michael is asking, do legacy solutions, Documentum, Interwoven, OpenText, have any future? And then I'd throw in the former IBM solutions, as well as Microsoft in there, Michael, and I'll say no, they do not. They are, in most cases, being cared for in kind of a assisted living, and so that's great for the customers already there. But these are platforms you leave, and not platforms that you license afresh. So with that, we've run about 6 or 7 minutes over time, but do want to thank you for participating with us today. We've got webinars, usually 2 or 3 a month, so definitely join our mailing list if you haven't already to stay on top of it. And again, if you have any questions at all about the WCM marketplace, decisions that you have, and how we can help you with some of our long experience with these vendors, please do reach out to my colleague, Scott. So for Scott and the rest of the Real Story Group team, this is Tony Byrne signing off for now. Bye now.